All right. Greetings and welcome to everyone here at the Center for Agroecology at UC Santa Cruz. We have a very special presentation for you tonight from Daryl Long about no-till agriculture. Thank you all for attending. All right, let's do this again. Greetings and welcome to the Center for Agroecology at UC Santa Cruz. We have a very special presentation for you tonight from Daryl Long about organic no-till agriculture. Thank you all for attending. My name is John O'Turner. I'm a board member for the Friends of the UCSC Farm and Garden. The Friends provide a public outreach service for the Center for Agroecology, and we are sponsoring tonight's program. If you're not already a member of the Friends, please consider joining. As a member, you'll receive special updates on current happenings at the Center for Agroecology, discounts on workshops we offer, discounts at some local nurseries, early admission to our spring plant sale, and invitation to special farm events, such as tonight's talk. The link page can be found on the Center for Agroecology site if you want to join. I was fortunate enough to be in this, to do the 6-month apprenticeship here up in 2018, and it was truly one of my best summers of my life. Our presenter tonight, Daryl Long, was one of my instructors of field operations, and we learned about and participated in the field scale practices of organic agriculture. Mechanical soil tillage was part of our instruction, and Daryl would speak of his deep concerns about disrupting the essential and long-term soil biology with regular tractoring and tillage. Since then, Daryl has become the executive director at the Center for Agroecology, and he also just completed a PhD here at UC Santa Cruz with research into organic no-till agriculture. Daryl now oversees the direction and the workings of the Center for Agroecology, where he advocates to improve agricultural policy and practices that include templates of effective organic soil pathogen control for large-scale strawberry production, the launch of a brand new BA in agroecology here, increased support for student basic needs and food security on campus and within the UC system, and a commitment to include and to support all who want to be part of the Center for Agroecology. Please welcome Daryl Long, Executive Director of the Center for Agroecology, and now freshly minted PhD, as he presents some better than groundbreaking results from his doctoral thesis. Thank you so much, Daryl, for taking this time out of your schedule to give this presentation. And everyone, please note online, any questions, please post them in chat, and we will be sending a recording of this in a few days. Thank you. There.
All right, thanks, Jono. Let me know if folks can hear me okay. I think we got to do the mic for the webinar. I haven't looked at who's online. I'll look really quick. Yeah, what I want to say is I wasn't that nervous about presenting. And then all these people started showing up. A lot of my mentors and folks that I've looked up to for years in the farming world. And so now I'm really nervous. Some folks are online, a lot of folks are in the room, but no, I do feel like I'm amongst friends. And yeah, I'm really excited to share this work because I think there's been so many circling conversations around it. And I will do my best to get through the slides, and then I'd like to have some back and forth conversation. It might be hard for folks that are in the webinar to do that, but we'll do our best. I hear Delise is great at facilitating webinar questions, but also with folks in the room, because I think we've got like some intellectual knowledge here that I think we can hopefully build off of. Just a little bit of the framework of the talk. You know, this was my PhD exit, so there is some academic work in here that hopefully will be interesting to folks both online and in the room. I'll try to move through that somewhat quickly, and also I think focus on some of the practical questions and practical application of some of this, if that's of interest to folks. But you know, do let me know throughout I think we can kind of go any direction in this, but like I said, hopefully time for conversation. All right, so still searching. A little point towards how the research went, I'll say, on research and extension in California organic no-till production. So a little bit, let's see here, make sure I'm here. Okay, so a little bit just to set the stage, right? We've seen an incredible increase in US agricultural output over the last century in terms of productivity and actually how much we're producing. This has come at a huge cost in terms of, or a huge proportion of our landscape has really changed from, again, more natural ecosystems away from subsistence agriculture and small farms into this really intensive or industrial scale agriculture. So huge land use changes. This has resulted, right? A lot of this is really clear for, I think, a lot of folks that have been around this work for some time, but huge environmental costs in terms of our biodiversity loss, issues with eutrophication and nutrient leaching into the Gulf of Mexico, as well as soil degradation worldwide. All of this is really, I think, oftentimes understood in the context of world population growth, and this increasingly, a lot of the current push for, I think, agricultural technologies and techniques is framed around this need to feed this growing population, right? Saying that we need to increase production on less and less productive land to make sure we can feed all of the people. Now, as somebody who graduated in environmental studies, a very interdisciplinary program, we know that actually the world currently produces enough food to feed everybody on the planet. This is really an issue of distribution and an issue of power and power dynamics. That said, right, we still need to transition, I think, what is our more industrial form of agriculture to something that is largely more sustainable to make sure that we hit some of those production thresholds. This is increasingly the case with climate change. And those of us in California have really felt, I think, all of these over the past just 3 years, right? We've done fires, we've done droughts, we've done floods. So what has kind of arisen as a sustainable alternative to more industrial scale practices? There's been lots of different types of production practices: organic, IPM, sustainable, now regenerative. But no-till has really been, I think, far and away one of the largest movements towards a more sustainable form of agriculture. So no-till, just to define it early on, this is from one of the earliest definitions, is really system of planting crops into untilled soil where you just open a little narrow slot and put the seed or plant in, and there's no other soil tillage done. To put it into context, right, conservation agriculture is a broad term that covers both no-till and other reduced tillage systems. In 2021, that was about almost 15% of global cropland was under conservation agriculture. To put it into context, right, organic agriculture was only 5.3%, right? So when you think about how has this been adopted as a more sustainable form of production, no-till, again, almost 3 times as much as organic production. There are some very serious and I think well-documented benefits to no-till production as it's being practiced across the globe, which really is around, I think, a lot of the physical properties of soil health that you get when you don't till the soil. Improving certain levels of soil organic matter, and really, I think, this whole host of processes that, again, we could spend a lot of time talking about, but there's really well-documented, again, I think, soil health benefits. Additionally, there's increasing evidence that in an economic sense, a lot of these no-till systems are more profitable over the long term. While you might see kind of decreased overall profits in the first maybe 10 or 11 years, there are studies, increasingly studies are showing that your kind of accumulated difference, your accumulated profit over time, these systems can be much more profitable. One of the biggest rationales for pushing these no-till systems is really about carbon, given global warming. And so a lot of these no-till systems, because of the reduction in passes from the tractor, can reduce those CO2 emissions from the farm by up to 84% when you're decreasing the number of passes that will happen. And there's a lot of excitement around no-till, especially when we talk about regenerative agriculture, when you talk about soil carbon stocks and the potential for soil carbon sequestration. So this is just, this is a slide from Jessica Chartis. But this just shows, again, in terms of petagrams of carbon and where the potential areas are, you can see that soil actually holds more potential carbon storage than both above ground plant biomass and the atmosphere and kind of the surface oceans combined, right? So people are saying, oh, if we can actually sequester this carbon. So if this system is so great, right, no-till, what are some of the challenges that that we've been seeing in these systems? So first of all, kind of coming to this carbon stock question, a lot of the early excitement around no-till systems was looking at carbon sequestration, but early studies where they did the meta-analyses, right, the kind of first 140 studies that were done, really looked at the top 6 inches of soil, which is where they typically collect soil samples from, and not actually the entire soil profile. And so what you see here is a map of a corn root system that actually matches to that soil depth. So this first little chunk here is actually the 6-inch system, right? That's 6 inches down in the soil, and we're not accounting for anything that happens below that in the no-till system. When you start to look at that over time, and again, this is a study that was done over a 20-year period comparing moldboard plow and no-till systems, we actually see kind of net reductions across a baseline in soil organic carbon accumulation in conventional no-till systems. So what we actually find over time is a redistribution of soil organic matter or soil organic carbon, where in a no-till system, and the slide here on the right shows that that little green chunk there shows that you get a little bit more carbon in the surface soil, but you actually see a reduction in that carbon as you go deeper down into the soil profile, because you're not incorporating a lot of that above ground biomass into the soil itself. Additionally, when you think about, again, conventional no-till agriculture, right, we see that, you know, there was this huge issue with the Dust Bowl in the 1930s that really spawned a lot of this conversation. But why wasn't it until some like the 70s and 80s when we really began to see an uptick in application of this? And it's really, it's not that it, you know, it wasn't, you know, what I want to say is in 1944, right, there was this issue about tillage, right, where it's, again, the hottest farming argument since the tractor first challenged the horse, which was this this acknowledgement that like tillage was a thing in the 40s, but we never really saw anything happen until the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The reason for that is that really these conventional no-till systems were developed in parallel with our new fast-acting herbicides, right? So previous to World War II and the development of what is now Roundup is we had herbicides that we could apply, but the plant back timings were too long. So you'd apply the herbicide, but you couldn't actually put a crop in the ground for a number of weeks after, whereas these fast-acting and broad-spectrum herbicides allowed for the development of no-till research, which allowed for the actual production practice to take hold. As a result, right, a lot of the research and interest right now around cover crops in no-till systems, right, there's a huge boom in cover crop research on conventional no-till systems, which is amazing from a diversity and soil health perspective. But a lot of these, this is a study that was looking about what are the different herbicides that you can use to burn down cover crops, right? So in these conventional no-till systems, the primary way that they're terminating their cover crops are with herbicides. And that allows them a lot of flexibility, as we'll talk about later, but it is a huge issue in terms of no-till production because you get, again, the increased development of super weeds, right? These herbicide-resistant weeds that as you're spraying the same chemicals year over year, you get these weeds that are starting to be resistant to herbicides that are going to really challenge those conventional systems. When you look at the cropland under conservation agriculture worldwide, you see that for the, again, the kind of more industrialized or developed countries, you see that Europe actually has a really small percent in conservation agriculture, largely as a result of their higher regulation on pesticide application. Which is why they don't really do no-till production, because so much of it is really dependent on herbicides for the system. And a lot of folks that have studied no-till for a long time will say herbicides and no-till go hand in hand. There's really no way that you can do one without the other. And then, you know, specifically in the California context is that a lot of these no-till systems that have been applied worldwide have really focused on what we call the commodity crops. So corn, soy, cotton, wheat. But not our nutritionally dense and diverse specialty crops, which we grow here in California, a large portion of. And these systems, as you can see from these two slides, are really vastly different, right? The slide on the left is, you know, corn planting, no-till corn planting, and the slide on the right is like organic lettuce harvest in the Salinas Valley, right? So there's the number of people, the perishability of the product, right? These are really different. So how do we improve some of these no-till systems, thinking about these major issues of carbon sequestration, pesticides, and crop and regional specificity? Well, one thing that might be totally obvious is that we have this thing called organic, which has been fairly successful in terms of meeting some of those challenges, right? So again, previous studies have shown increased soil organic matter accumulation in organic systems. Folks have reduced the use of pesticide, and organic has really shown to be profitable across a number of different crops and regions. So if we dig into a little bit of the research and thinking about some of these issues in organic, this is a little bit like the literature review, the background on organic no-till, and we look across these challenges, we'll kind of see what folks have learned. So if we look broadly at organic no-till, again, mostly in the research has mostly been done in commodity crops and organic. And this is, again, focusing specifically on carbon sequestration. There's not really sufficient long-term studies. There's very few systems that have been run organically for more than 20 years for us to study what that difference has been. But what I want to take a little bit of time to present right now is a little bit of kind of the current academic research that speaks to what I think is the potential of organic no-till, and one reason why I continue to stay really excited about this research and this potential, despite what I'll show is some of the challenges and failures that we had. So I'm going to get a little bit out over my skis here and dip into some like soil science that does not, it's like adjacent to my work. But again, for those, I have to make my apologies to Wei Shin and Joji and folks in our department that really know this stuff because it's a little bit out, but I'll do my best. So really, there's been a change in terms of the soil science and how we understand soil organic matter accumulation in the last decade. And previously, and this really reflects what I think some of the understanding that even I had 20 years ago from a practical training perspective of how we accumulate soil organic matter, it's really changed. So the classic old model of soil organic matter accumulation, that it was really, this was about kind of humic substances and recalcitrant molecules. So it's basically what you put in the ground. If it's more resistant to microbial breakdown, the idea was that many different pathways might mean that you would have higher levels of soil organic matter accumulation when you applied those types of things. So you think about the difference between, say, straw, right, which is kind of a high carbon, low nitrogen, brown material, put that into soil, versus something fresh like a legume. You put a legume in, it's going to burn down, it's going to mineralize somewhat quickly in your system, versus something that's more kind of harder to break down. But that has actually been replaced with some of the new science by this emerging soil organic matter model, which is really that a lot of the long-term soil organic matter in the soil is derived through microbial processes. A lot of this, 50 to 80%, is actually microbial necromass, which is a fancy way of saying like dead microbes and their bodies. And there's this real focus on stoichiometry, which is basically what you feed the microbes. So it's that the composition of nutrients. And the idea here is that if you feed microbes a diverse diet that matches what their makeup is, they'll be healthier than if you feed them just the N, the P, and the K, right? So we'll get to some of what that specifically is. And this idea of physical protection, in that these small dead microbial bodies that make up the soil organic matter can actually get physically protected by the soil itself so that it stays as long-term soil organic matter and doesn't go away quite so quickly. So again, these are some slides just about kind of the classical view, which again, different pathways, but all based around the makeup of the material that you are putting into the soil, versus the emerging view, which is a little bit more these kind of formation and destruction back and forth that allows for long-term sequestration of organic material. This is really important because when we talk about soil organic matter, right, about 50% of that is soil organic carbon. So when we're specifically looking at carbon sequestration, soil organic matter is our proxy. So this idea of really this dynamic stability, where it's not just that the soil organic matter may exist on its own, but that it continually is cycles through soil microbial processing and absorption and desorption from the actual soil particles themselves, right? So it's this idea of, we have this soil ecology that by stimulating that microbial growth, we're actually going to increase soil organic matter accumulation long-term. And that's really different than, again, the way that at least I understood it 20 years ago. What's really interesting and maybe potentially not surprising, especially some of the folks in the room that have been doing these practices for longer than I've been alive, is that the management practices to support this dynamic stability of soil organic matter and soil organic carbon are things that are really baseline to organic production systems. So cover cropping, residue retention and high C input crops, organic amendments, and reduced or responsible tillage. These are all parts of the system that, again, studies now have shown really support this kind of dynamic process. Also, when you look at some of the recent studies looking at soil organic carbon accumulation at depth. So, right, we looked earlier about initial studies just looking at 6 inches, work out of Davis that was just published recently. These are all in tillage-based systems, but the only system that really showed long-term whole profile change in carbon stocks was an organic system that had compost and cover crops involved. And a lot of that in this cycling process of microbes, what happens is that there's a lot of potential for leaching of those kind of those processes deep into the soil profile, so that you'll see, right, that kind of dark brown is our organic system, and you see increases in accumulation all the way down to 200 centimeters, right? So this was data from 1993 to 2012. So again, over a long period of time. So that's, again, when we talk about carbon sequestration, the potential for organic, I think that's where one reason why, again, I like to think about, given the emerging science around soil organic matter and carbon accumulation, why organic no-till, I think, continues to be such an important prospect. Now, when we think about, what has organic done, what are the ways to manage pesticides and weeds within an organic no-till system, we'll start to get into some of the challenges. So for folks that aren't familiar, the typical way to run a no-till system with in an organic system is to basically grow up a cover crop. The idea is that cover crop will get enough biomass, you'll then roll it down with a roller crimper right here. And the idea is that rolls down your cover crop, it pinches the vascular tissue. And then the idea is it doesn't come back and you kind of grow a mulch in place. And ideally what you get is the slide to the right, where it's soybeans coming up through a rolled down rye cover crop, right? And that's perfect. That's a great system. Turns out it's a little bit more complicated. And this is some research that basically looked at these, what they call mulch no tillage systems. And this is really from across the country, but really focused on, again, corn and soybean crops, and the challenges that they have with some of these mulch-based, these roller crimper systems. So I won't get into, we can come back to the slide and discuss some of these specifics, but, they talk about the main challenges being cash crop sowing into mulch, right? Which is just like, how do you just get the crop into the mulch if it's really thick and heavy? Cover crop regrowth, what happens when that cover crop doesn't die? Weed competition, what happens when you grow a cover crop, but either it doesn't have enough biomass or it breaks down too quickly? And then what are all of those accumulated impacts on yield in the system? So what are their strategies that they look towards to improving those is really ideas around how do we establish the cover crop, what do we plant, when do we plant it? How do we terminate that cover crop? Is it a roller crimper? Is it a flail mower? Is it multiple passes, multiple directions? And then how do you actually establish the cover crop? So seeder performance, planting date, row spacing, things like that. So yeah, these basics. One thing we have to address in the organic system is this idea of nitrogen asynchrony. And so this is already an issue in tillage-based systems, where in organic systems, all of our fertility is microbially mediated. So in a conventional system, you're allowed to apply ammonia basically in a form that's almost basically plant available. But in an organic system, we have to rely on all the decomposers, no matter what our fertility is that we put in, to actually get to a plant available form. As a result, there's all these environmental factors that inform how much of that fertilizer is mineralized or made available to the plant. So again, this is a challenge in tilled systems where we see kind of cover crop mineralization can happen much faster than when the plant actually needs it. What happens in no-till systems is that we also have this additional trade-off. So one, we're not tilling the soil, which is going to really spur that microbial process. So we don't see the same amount of nitrogen mineralization from organic fertilizers or even from our soil organic matter. And two, there's this trade-off with weed management that requires a high CN ratio, a high carbon to nitrogen ratio for residue persistence, which would be grasses, versus a low CN ratio, which would be necessary for nutrient release, which would be legumes. And so you kind of have to have this trade-off where if you're growing a cover crop for weed suppression, you don't get the nutrient benefit. If you grow it for nutrients, you don't get the weed suppression benefit. And there's these great ideas of having a mixture of crops, right? Well, let's do the same thing we do in a tillage-based system where we grow grasses and legumes, but then you have this termination asynchrony, where in organic systems, because we're not using an herbicide to burn down our cover crops, we have to rely on biological timing to terminate those crops, and different species are going to biologically mature at different times. So that becomes a real challenge. So now, just as a kind of review of organic no-till, mainly commodity crop systems across the US, the most success that folks have had are in soybean systems in Canada, the Midwest, and the kind of mid-Atlantic. Yields tend to fall about, somewhere roughly about 24% behind tilled systems. But because you have the cost savings in terms of tractor passes and inputs, you can actually see a system that's more profitable. Most of those systems are not truly no-till in that they actually rely on fall tillage to establish the cover crop, because that cover crop establishment is so important for the crop. And that's a really important thing to comment on, because I think a lot of times that gets glossed over. Corn yields, because it's not, soybeans are a legume, so they can fix nitrogen. Corn yields have not really met economic viability thresholds in these no-till systems because of some of those issues with nutrient access and release. Also, because you tend to have a smaller planting or growing window, you have to rely on different cultivars that are shorter season, and you don't get the yields that you would get with some of the longer cultivars. And in the Northern Great Plains, where water is a little bit more limited, there was some research that was looked at basically animal cover crop termination of cover crops, and that led to yield reductions of 50 to 75% in wheat. So this is, again, there's these differences between the kind of semi-arid and some of these more humid and environments where they have rainfall throughout the summer and into the fall versus where you don't have rainfall, and seeing these really intense yield reductions. So now, when we look at what's happened in organic so far, while we may have solved for pesticides and we have some potential on carbon sequestration, we've created a lot of other issues to solve around cover crop management, nutrient management, and some real just agronomic basics of just like, how do we get that crop in the ground? So now I want to pivot a little bit to like organic no-till vegetables and what does the research show on that again across the country. And it really mirrors that wheat production system in the Great Plains, which is early failures and incredible inconsistency. So of the reviews that I did of like the 67 papers, academic published papers on organic no-till, over 80% were published in the last 10 years. So this is still really very recent research. And it's really characterized by what I would consider basically incredible crop failures, right? Almost complete crop failures, right? So tomatoes, right? You look at year 1 and year 2, these are yield declines. So 80% yield decline versus a tilled system. In year 2, it was 65%. Zucchini, 77%, year 2, 41%. So just this inconsistency year over year. And again, what I would classify as like complete crop failure. If you look at it across kind of crop category, we see potential success. Some cucurbit studies were able to match production. Some brassica studies were able to match production. Leaf crops, there's really limited data. And solanums tend to have the most success with tomatoes. But again, there's real inconsistency. And what I'll say is that a lot of the research, when you look into the methods, there's a real lack of, a lot of these no-till systems were just done by somebody using a jab planter to get it in the ground. And a lot of times when they compare yield, they'll compare yield from a no-till system with a tilled experimental system, but they won't compare it against commercial yields. And so they'll show equivalency in terms of no-till to till in their research plots, but the tilled system has basically what would be considered a commercial crop failure when you compare to commercial yields. So there's a lot of inconsistency in the data and how it's presented that I think takes some ferreting through. But my read of most of it is that these systems are very underdeveloped in terms of how we can get yields. So takeaways, catastrophic losses. So we need a lot of basic agronomic experimentation. Tomatoes and broccoli had the potential to be the most successful. And I think that really speaks to the expansive root systems that these plants have and their access to, I think, their ability to scavenge nutrients a little bit better. A lot of paired plasticulture systems were quite successful. And this is work that when we've seen this in trials regionally, we see, the influence of plastic on top of crops has, I think, a lot of potential to spur a different properties within the agro ecosystem to have yields match. And then oftentimes it was really high levels of fertility additions that led to yield equivalency. So up to 3 times what you would normally apply in a tillage-based system. There's a couple studies in Italy where that was the case. And so these are just some, again, I think this isn't like a full meta-analysis. There's no statistical understanding of all the different 67 studies that we looked at, but those are some things that kind of came out in my analysis. So now let's take all of that. That's kind of global and national context. Let's put into the California context, which, again, we are the state that we are the leader in specialty crops, specifically in organic. Well over 90% of all the organic major specialty crops are produced in our state. And we are in a highly drought susceptible state, right? Especially with climate change. When you think about, this is a graph of percent of no-till acres in 2017, and California ranks way down at the bottom because, right, just the way that our political economic landscape is set up in California is that our crops are so high value, they require such high turnover, our land rents are so high because of the crops that can be grown here, that this is so different than the corn and soy production systems in the Midwest and worldwide, where a lot of this no-till work is being done. So there's a lot of challenges, right? That's kind of setting the stage for this is what we know. So what's the trial that we tried to do here, and how do we try to address some of those things? So again, we measured carbon sequestration in our trial. It was an organic system without pesticides. We tried to design something with crop and regional specificity. So I'll show the slides, but we basically did a lettuce and broccoli rotation for 3 years. To address some of the issues of cover crop management, what we implemented was a low or no residue no-till system where we grew up a crop that we knew we could terminate really easily, but that would decompose fairly quickly, with this idea being if we had a short turnaround crop, maybe it would do its own weed suppression via canopy closure. Nutrient management, we wanted to make sure we had enough flexibility in terms of how we applied nutrients to address some of these issues. And then we were really looking at some of the agronomic basics because, again, the systems that have been developed for no-till systems, a lot are developed around these commodity crops, but have not been developed for our specialty crops. So that was a big focus of the work that we were doing. And then really addressing this issue of water, which is really important for us in California. So what did this system look like? We basically had a fall cover crop of white mustard. So that, again, we knew from past experience, this is a crop that we could terminate early on a wide window and not have reseeding and terminate it almost 100%. We went from that. This is, again, the trial. So you see our tilled plots. We did a full tillage and a shallow tillage treatment, and then the no-till plot that you can see here in the bottom corner. That was planted to lettuce. So again, you see the no-till section in the front of that slide, the tilled sections in the back. Again, lettuce as it was maturing more. We then went into a buckwheat summer cover crop in between the 2 crops. Folks with astute eyes will notice the lettuce regrowth in the backside. That was the no-till lettuce that regrew after harvest. That went into broccoli. So again, we did broccoli and then finished again with white mustard after that. So that was kind of how we developed the system to try to address some of these challenges within that California context. We had 4 reps and 3 different treatments for the statistical analysis. So I'll go through some of what we found on some of these. So on the agronomic basics, again, and big shout out and credit to Jim Leap. This was all at his house where we put this stuff together. But the story I like to tell is like, we had the transplanters out here in California and I had to buy all the no-till equipment from the Midwest, and then nobody could tell me how to put them all together. So Jim and I did a little bit of welding and a little bit of fabricating and came up with this somewhat unique system where, for folks, and again, I'll go into more detail in this than I did with like the faculty on campus. But, what we did is we basically put an 8-wave 2-inch wide coulter ahead of a pick that runs ahead of the transplanter that it was a boot and it was a slide transplanter. So it wasn't a rolling wheel. It was actually a slide type. And that's what we used to actually open that planting slot and then put the plant right in. The slide you see on the far right is how we did our fertilizer applications. That one was pretty simple. It was just putting a straight coulter in ahead of our fertilizing shank and let that fertilizer drop right in. But in the end, we had this, a very similar transplanter that, again, we kind of put into this compact unit that we could actually do for our crops. There was a lot of trial and error in terms of figuring out how to get these plants in the ground. And it took, I think, about 1.5 years to really get it right. And a lot of it was about moisture, right? So if our moisture wasn't right in the no-till system, it slicked over too hard and we didn't get kind of line closure. If it was too dry, it was kind of too chunky. But if we hit that moisture just right, we had to really learn on when to apply moist water ahead of planting so that that no-till transplanter would work. So that was the kind of agronomics. And then let's see how it did in terms of the different crops. How did the production work out, and how that integrated with nutrient management. So this was our yield over the 3 years. And you'll see that the no-till is in red, our full till is blue, and our shallow till is green. So we saw really no difference between the shallow and full till treatments. These are what would I consider as, definitely in year 1, but in year 2 and 3 as well, fairly consistent commercial yields on the tillage side, but, the no-till really was operating at like 1/3 of that production. That was really similar. We saw similar things in broccoli. We had an issue in the first year with just a late planting, but again, while we saw, yields of the full till and the shallow till really producing, I think, pretty good yields, the no-till really didn't perform. What is interesting to note is that we did see a slight increase over time in the no-till on the broccoli, and some indication that potentially with more development of that system, and broccoli being a crop that would perform better in no-till systems, there might be a chance that it could continue to perform better and better over time. When we looked at the nutrient dynamics, again, in terms of the total inorganic, which is basically like the available nitrogen in the soil, while we saw some spikes in certain times for the full till treatment, we didn't see a lot of difference over time between the available nitrogen in both systems, but we still saw these incredible yield depressions. In the first year, we did our standard about 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre application. That's our standard for our tillage-based system. We doubled that in subsequent years, but saw no yield response in our no-till system. When we looked at water, because our system basically was a no residue system, so we had these cover crops that we had chosen because they were easy to terminate, but then we kind of lost that weed suppression, and we also lost the kind of soil cover, which the mulch and water retention. What we actually saw, and again here, for folks that haven't read graphs like this before, this is volumetric water content, and the higher it is on the graph, the more water there is, and the lower it is, the drier it is. And so what I just want to point out is specifically for like the broccoli at the surface, you'll see that even though they started, we were irrigating them at the same time, the broccoli consistently dried out, the soil dried out faster and faster in the no-till plots than it did in the tilled plots, mainly because if we didn't have that mulch on the surface and when we hadn't broken the capillaries in the soil, it was just wicking water out like crazy. And so, this is, Tom's laughing, don't tell the story before I can get to it. But yeah, so we saw this really interesting water dynamic that we weren't expecting to see, right? Because a lot of times soil water holding capacity tends to increase with no-till production systems, but because we didn't have that important kind of mulch aspect, we saw it dry out a lot quicker. So even though I feel like we had our weed control relatively, it wasn't really a weed issue, but you could see, right, our no-till lettuce, this is all at 21 or at 31 days post-planting, you see these really intense differences in size, right? And that was matched for both our lettuce and even our buckwheat, right? Where when you look at it at the same time, the system was not really performing. I think match that with, something that I want to make sure that we highlight is lettuce survival, which was really as a result of gopher damage. And this is something that not a lot of people will comment on it informally, but folks won't show data on it. But we found that in our, again, while there was no statistical difference, it really appeared that in our no-till systems where we weren't breaking up pathways for gophers, that we just saw such faster take in those plots. And it was so much harder for us as a management team to gopher trap in those areas because the gophers were right back at it right away as soon as we planted. So we saw a lot faster takedown and at a lot higher numbers. Similarly, when we looked at soil temperature, we saw really interesting differences. Again, broccoli was more or less the same, but the lettuce slide is what's interesting to look at because we see, again, the no-till actually had much higher relative soil temps than the tilled-based systems. And again, I think that's because we didn't actually have any mulch cover, right, to moderate the temperature. And we didn't have the canopy closure that broccoli had. So I think that soil was just heating up a lot more. That didn't result in higher nitrogen release or higher mineralization, right? So yeah, some questions there. And I think overall, right, when you look at all these issues, the water, the nutrient management, the cover crop management, and how the crops performed, like what I saw was a system totally out of balance, right? And again, I think it speaks to this kind of unique system where it was a low residue, no mulch, no till system that was really integral to why that I think failed so wonderfully. Yeah, so I did want to I think I want to pair this with a little bit of work. So again, Tom, who's in the room, was part of this group that was run by Jeff Mitchell that was working on a number of farms across the state that were working on reduced tillage in organic specialty crops. And I just wanted to reflect on this a little bit from a research perspective, because what was amazing to me in watching some of these other growers that a lot were kind of like the leaders in organic ag and approaching this, one was just their passion and inspiration to do this. They all run businesses that are economically viable, that have been around for decades. They could just be kind of resting on their laurels and doing what they want to do, but a lot of them just have this passion for how could we do it any better? And we're throwing what I would say is like the kitchen sink at these issues. So here you see just a couple of the different strip tillage or vertical tillage treatments that folks were growing in. And what I want to highlight here is a little bit this difference in terms of research approaches and thinking about it in terms of this like temporal nature of how we address some of what I would consider somewhat like these like paradigm changes in, I think, agroecosystems. So to me, I think some of these approaches, which was really what I think these growers were doing was really action knowledge and action-oriented research, and is really what is considered really adaptive research. So you think about how research is done in medical situations, and there's a really clear protocol that if you start something in a medical treatment and it's very clear that a system is not working, you stop that treatment right away. You don't take it to the end because the benefits of the control group, you can't morally justify, right, continuing that. And so I think we oftentimes don't think about that in agricultural research, but in many ways, and this is a story that I want to tell about Tom, is like Tom came out after the first lettuce planting and looked at the field and was like, Daryl, there's no soil cover on that. Like, how is this? I don't think the system is going to work. And I continued it for 3 more years to find out, like, yeah, what Tom saw 6 months into the trial was what we kind of should have acted on a little bit more quickly. And so it's not to discount, I think, a lot of what we consider this kind of epistemic or more academic knowledge and the research that comes out of it, but to understand where we are in terms of this system development, we need more of that intuitive and action knowledge research, I think, at this point, to understand what's really possible and feasible across these systems. And so I was really impressed with that. I will counter that to say, and this is just a framework for agricultural innovation systems that comes out of the farmer, what is it, field schools, or I'm blanking on the name right now. But folks that have worked really in more in the global South context, and this idea that there are different ways to think about innovation systems, one that are kind of purely analytical in terms of how do we kind of transfer technology, right? We understand it from one way, we're really supporting, I think, growers growing better. And you can think about that in terms of the way that a lot of traditional ag research has happened, right? We want to improve yields, so we're going to do new technology that's going to improve yields and improve profits for the growers. What it oftentimes doesn't take into account are some of these normative issues, which are really thinking about these kind of social outcomes, right, and community outcomes. So when you do that type of technological transfer in that mechanical analytical box, you oftentimes end up with these consequences that are like a lot of small farms going out of business. And we see the consolidation in the ag industry now as a result of some of these top-down mechanical approaches. And so while I think there is both this real importance to work within those kind of more intuitional and action-oriented systems, I think it's also what we weren't able to do, I think, within that group is really think about some of the broad political economic contexts that are really constraining our choices as growers, right? And what I mean by that is, right, just the fact that we consider land a private good versus a public good, like how would that framing really change our ability to implement a system that's not where land rents aren't driven, at least in our area, by strawberry production and yield, right? So some of these kind of things that operate outside. So that, again, I think it really speaks to the challenges that we have as California growers. And, you know, I think what I want to highlight is some of the intersection of those two different, I think, research and action approaches. And I think one thing that really highlights it for me is, you know, I think this is the mechanical tomato harvester that was produced at UC Davis. And a lot of times I think people think about like ag mechanization as something that is just inherently is going to happen, right? This treadmill of progress. But what oftentimes is not acknowledged is that to develop a mechanical tomato harvester, you had to have this nonlinear and totally asynchronous development of lots of other technologies at the same time, including laser leveling and tomato crop breeding to be able to be mechanically harvested. And it took this whole systems approach across many different avenues to create the system that we have today. And so I think in presenting those kind of two different ways of thinking about research, I think it's interesting to think about what would a similar type of research process look like to support something like organic no-till, right? Where again, tomato growers were never going to be able to do this on their own farms within their economic context in the 60s, right? But because like UC Davis was able to put all these resources into land leveling, into laser leveling and tomato crop production, right? Like we could do a similar thing for no-till or more sustainable production practices that would potentially yield, I think, great benefits. And again, like what we know the outcome of this is that there were 4,000 tomato growers that grew for the canning tomato market before this happened. And a decade later, there was 400, right? So again, that's all like fairly well documented, but I think we have a broader conception. So I think I've done pretty good on time. I'll talk a little bit about where I think some future research directions are, and then I think we can open it up for questions and again, have plenty of time. And if we need to end early, we can end early. But again, I'm excited to have, you know, folks in the room. So again, in thinking about this kind of difference between action knowledge and some of the epistemic knowledge, I think there's this potential to think about where the different approaches are really applicable. And I think this focus on some of the basic agronomic challenges of no-till systems, I think that is an area that I think we should really focus on, which is just like, how do we get these plants and seeds in the ground? How do we deal with high residue cultivation, fertility application and selection? You know, water would be part of that. And this is something that we should do in a way that is really like, throw the kitchen sink at it. Start it in a year. If it doesn't look like it's working, change it in the next cycle in that same year. But it probably doesn't lend itself to this multi-year replicated approach, right? Because it's just, that takes too much time and too many resources to, I think, learn some of the things that we need to do. The challenge when you try to do that is when you try to do it all at once is that I think you sacrifice both, right? You don't have the flexibility to work on some of those basic agronomic issues. And you also then don't get the results that you want to see in terms of what might happen in the soil because you've made too many trade-offs in terms of how you implement that trial. So I think something that would fall in kind of the hybrid category is this suitability of cover crops and specific cash crop rotations. So I think if we are going to move towards a mulch-based no-till system, we may need to think about what are the specific pairings of cover crops and cash crops that really match. So white mustard that we used may be a great no-till cover crop in a system that's well developed for an early lettuce planting, but don't try to do that year over year. You'll have to match that with a rye that would go into either winter squash or a tomato crop, right? But have those specific cash crops paired with cover crops. And I think we haven't done nearly enough research in terms of what the different varieties are of cover crops, let alone the potential for breeding cover crops for no-till production, right? Where we're breeding stuff that's high biomass, early termination, whatever the case may be. So I think there's a potential hybrid approach where some of those things, I think we could look at some specific cash crop yields in the face of cover crop selection. And I think something to focus on, some of the long-term studies assessing that potential of organic no-till. So again, back to that idea of organic carbon sequestration in organic systems, we haven't seen studies that look at what happens when you do a lot of organic amendments, when you do high compost applications. How does that impact your soil carbon accumulation over time in a no-till system? I don't think at this point you can do that while also trying to produce a cash crop, because I think it's not going to work. So the idea would be, how do you mimic what some of those systems might look like to see if you get those soil benefits and essentially prime that system for integration of cash crops, but it might take 3 or 5 years down the road to point towards what's possible. And that's where I think we really would rely on some of the, again, the epistemic or the academic knowledge to look at, you know, what's happening with those nitrogen cycling systems, what's happening with the soil microbes and the microbial ecology. If you do dedicate a system to that over, say, a 5-year period where you're not trying to get a cash crop out of it, but you're just seeing what cover crops, compost, manures, those types of organic amendments do in that system, so we can understand that potential. So yeah, so that's a little bit on future research directions. I did just want to, you know, a quick shout out to some of my early farming partners. So this is Kirsten and Amy Courtney. So Amy Courtney is actually the first person that taught me how to drive a tractor. When I started at Free Wheeling Farm, it was a cute little B-series Kubota with a 30-inch spader on the back. It had a hydrostatic transmission, so it was really forgiving. And then Kirsten has been my farming partner for over 15 years. And yeah, has been a thought partner in all of this over time. So I was able to go to school and get the PhD, but she gets like the honorary one just for being part of it. So, and Kirsten's staff here at the center now as well. So, all right, so that's the talk. Thank you. Yeah, and maybe we can have some conversation, and I think, yeah, maybe do a little bit on questions from online. And yeah, again, for folks in the audience that want to dive specifically into any of the different areas a little bit more. Weed shift. Yeah, so we didn't collect that data, but there was only so much that I could do. Yeah, and you know, it was fairly remarkable, actually. We saw a lot more prevalence of annual grasses in the no-till systems pretty quickly. Like about after 2 years, we saw the annual grasses in the system a lot more. That was the major shift that we saw without really documenting it. I don't know exactly. I mean, you could tell me. It's what's been around on the edges of the farm. It just crept in to that no-till system. Oh, okay, great. So that question was, what about annual weed, or what do we see in terms of weed shifts over years of the trial? Yeah.
I'm curious, Gerald, about differences that you notice in your shallow till versus standard.
Yeah, so the question is about the difference in the shallow till system versus the full till system. So again, I can describe a little bit more what those systems were. So the full till is not what I think would be considered, you know, I think would be largely, it's the system that we've done here at the center for for decades, that I think would be more responsible tillage with a spader. So a single pass with a spader, and then, you know, if we need, and then potentially a rototilling pass with bed shaping, went down to about 10 inches. And that's very different than a lot of the conventional tillage systems that oftentimes are compared against, where it's 12 to 15 passes with discs and chisels and things like that. And then our shallow till system was really, we used a lot of undercutters, an undercutter bar to finish crops. And then we would use a small tandem disc as tillage ahead of cover crop. And then ahead of bed prep, we'd use a rototiller. So we were really managing tillage to about 5 inches down. And didn't see a lot of differences. You know, again, from my like anecdotal eye, it looked like it probably would struggle over time without deeper tillage. The full till definitely had, you know, deeper green and fuller leaves, but the yields matched up in terms of statistical significance. But to me, it's still, you know, so I think there's potential in that shallow till system, but I don't know how it would perform over time. Would be a question of whether we would have some issues with some kind of deeper soil compaction. And we actually saw a little bit of prevalence of root knot nematode, or no, club root in some of our brassicas, which we never see out on the farm here, unless we've done a couple times where we leave bare fallows through the winter for an early like January planting. And we've seen clubroot pop up because, our system here, Jim, as you well know, is very different than like Watsonville or the Salinas Valley, where, we'll see 30 inches of rain annually versus 12 inches, down in Watsonville. So our soils just will stay a little bit more saturated, even though they're sandy loam. So we saw a little bit of that in the no-till system. We saw it both in the shallow till and the full till. So I don't know that it was related, but that's something that I could imagine would be an issue. Yeah, in the back. Yeah. Yeah, similar to the weed analysis, I had to kind of like call it at some point. In terms of the analysis, just to, again, a good dissertation is a done dissertation is what I've been told. And again, the faculty always want you to do all the different things, but one thing we had planned to do was actually look at root biomass. And one of my one of my advisors was really interested in doing that. But so we actually dug out 30 by 30 by 30 centimeter cubes of soil, so about a foot by a foot by a foot, and sifted through to actually weigh root biomass. We did that once in one plot it took like 15 students, like 6 hours. And I was like, I'm sorry, we cannot do this. So, but there's a lot of interesting work being done around that and Tom, I don't know, you might have do you have any updates on any of the work that around microbial communities in the no-till systems? I'm not sure if anything's been really conclusive in terms of, some of this has been studied at some of the
really just beginning.
Yeah.
We know that certain practices increase and certain conditions increase microbial biomass.
Yeah.
You get a lot of data out of that.
Yeah.
Really hard to make it.
Yeah. So Tom was confirming we're really at the early stages of understanding microbial communities. We see some increases in microbial biomass and some indications of microbial health in terms of respiration, right? How much CO2 are they producing in these no-till systems? But I think in some ways we just have the techniques to understand, like some of the DNA and RNA techniques where we can understand what those communities are. Like we can see that array, but we actually don't understand the functionality of any of those groups and what they're doing. So I think you should be really cautious when you hear folks talk about like fungal to bacterial ratios and these things that, again, I think are really exciting, but from somebody that, again, my personal opinion is that, I don't think that we've seen enough research to really support that we know what the actual impact of that is.
So, afterwards, I'm curious, what was the inspiration behind this kind of bringing the no-till to sort of like I guess conventional ag system, mechanized? What got going on?
Yeah, so the question was, what was the inspiration to bring the no-till to more of like a, what'd you call it? A larger scale? Yeah. I think, early on in the talk, we kind of laid out some of the excitement around that and just the potential of no-till and the potential of kind of pairing that with organic and what it could do. I will say, to be honest, some of the inspiration in an early iteration of the proposal, we'd actually wanted to compare to a hand scale no-till system, because this is another interesting avenue of research, and one that Joji Muramoto is working on right now, kind of on the site here. But there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence that in organic no-till hand scale systems, folks are seeing some of these like incredible like production figures where, again, what we estimate from a tractor-based system for a direct market farm is, grossing, so amount of how much you produce to sell, about like $25,000 per acre. And these systems are purporting like $250,000 per acre. the hand scale systems
If you extrapolated it, like, for.
on a per acre basis. Yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah. So again, like that's a crazy number, right? And you're like, is that even possible? Right. And yeah, and I think there's a lot of excitement around that, but I do think there's significant digging that needs to be figured out in those systems. One about what they're marketing and market number, like who are they marketing to? What are their price points? Like if this is happening in New England, where you can get $18 a pound for salad mix, that's never going to fly in California, where the wholesale price is like $2.45 a pound. Right. And some of the systems that have been doing this for a long time, while they've shown some incredible, I think, soil health benefits, they're also very clear that like they're only profiting as a family and as a business like $30,000 a year. Right. And we know that like there has to be other, that's not an economically viable system. So I think there's more research to be done towards that effect, but I think it's to me, those systems are really based on this heavy compost application as a mulching. And I think there may be a key in that. And that's one reason why I'd like to look at that. I think in future research towards this is what does it look like when we do those application rates? Our standard application from a maintenance perspective is about 5 to 10 tons per acre in an organic tillage-based system here. And some folks in like the Midwest that are running these hand scale systems are applying somewhere between 78 and 142 tons per acre of compost to get that 1-inch layer of mulch, essentially. So there's interesting questions about, I think, nutrient leaching in those systems, especially in rain environments. But, I think there's also the potential that when you don't have tillage in those systems, you may be moderating for some of those leaching effects. And actually our new faculty that just started here on July 1st, Hannah Waterhouse, has been looking at that in the context of the California state legislation that's now mandating composting across the state, right? Like, so if you live in California, you know that everybody has to compost now. And she's really looking at some of that intersection between what happens with some of that nutrient leaching and intersections with tillage. So oftentimes we do see, again, organic growers don't want to hear this, but like your fall tillage events, you put cover crop seed in the ground and then it rains, but that cover crop's not established. And you see incredible like booms of nitrogen, warm soils, tillage, like residual compost from fertilizer. You see these huge booms of nitrogen availability that oftentimes will get leached through because you don't have your cover crop established at that point. So yeah, some interesting research potentially on that. Okay. Yeah.
Rob wants to know how many of these studies that you cited, a bunch of studies, took place in Mediterranean climates and/or California.
So all of the organic no-till vegetable studies, there was one that was done in California. That was in the 90s. That was Jeff Mitchell and Mark Van Horn at UC Davis.
So you were comparing to a different climate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, a lot of the reason, again, the way I tried to stack it was like looking at organic no-till across commodity crops in the nation, then looking at organic no-till vegetables across, because you can't compare against California because there's nothing to compare it to.
Got
Yep.
it. All right. Could you ask Daryl if he has any thoughts on using no-till practices in strawberries? Does he think that reduced yield during the transition would eventually balance out to higher yields?
That feels like such I can't see the practical application of no-till and strawberry. It feels so far off to me. Mainly because of our issues for needing rotation in strawberries and organic systems. I would imagine even if you tried to do ASD with the tarping, I think you'd see incredible disease buildup if you couldn't rotate. And if you're, I think there's too many issues with that production system would be my sense. I mean, yeah. The need for plastic for weed management. But I'm trying to think outside the box here. I think if you had shaped up tall beds for strawberries, you pulled the plastic off and then you put plastic back on and ran a crop through the center. It would have to be a heavy plastic culture system for that to work. And my guess is that if you did no-till in a plastic culture system, you actually probably wouldn't encounter even half of the issues that we have. So some of the work was it at Full Belly, Tom, or was it at Pinnacle? Yeah. Yeah. So mainly at Phil Foster's place, did work where there was, we mowed off, he mowed off the cover crop and then tarped it with plastic and planted into it. And we saw really similar production yields to the tilled system. And again, that system, you think about the dynamics that are happening, you have all this biomass that's on the surface, but now is humid and warm. And you get this, so you get this like moisture in our system, right? There was a serious moisture gradient where basically where the drip lines were, you would see moisture, but it wouldn't spread across the soil surface. In that system with a mulch-based system, you can water with drip tape, but it'll really spread across the surface because that plastic mulch is in place. So you get warm, wet, lots of biomass. It's prime conditions for microbial and nutrient release. And so I think we see the yield increases. So I think where I'm hesitating on the strawberry production is that the labor, we don't have the mechanization and the labor it would take to basically pull up all that plastic and replace it without disturbing those beds, and how you would manage the furrows. Anyway, I think there's some interest there, but yeah, I think would have to heavily rely on plastic.
Okay. Cost concerns with reduced tillage equipment and no till equipment required for growers that want to switch. Is it really pricey? I mean, you were making it, you were building it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'd say yes and no. You know, the no-till cover crop grain drills are much more expensive. So we're talking, yeah, some of those new, even for like a 6 foot, you know, we're up in the $18,000 range, which is going to be a lot more than you need to pay for even a used grain drill. But a lot of I think there's a little bit of add-on for some of the transplanters, but I think it's more about, we don't have the transplanters that are designed for our systems in specialty crops. So we have a water wheel transplanter that didn't cost, I think it was, you know, maybe 7,000 for a 2-row unit. That's a no-till water wheel transplanter, but that a 2-row unit isn't really going to cut it. So 2 rows set on 36 inches, that's not really going to cut it in a specialty crop system where you need to be a lot more productive. So again, it's this, there's an issue of needing to probably create that equipment. So that might be the cost issue.
You may have already answered this in your talk, but have you looked at literature concerning cover crop cultivar improvement for no-till?
I didn't see really any mention of, can they hear you? Probably close.
I hope so.
Yeah. Okay. I was at the button. I didn't see any indications of that in any of the research. Anybody looking at that about cultivar development? There's definitely comments about that should be studied, and I would agree, right? I mean, we're still all using like AGS 104 or Merced Rye. Like it's like the only one, but I think there's, again, we should think about what we could do by basically breeding cover crops, but also breeding cash crops to work within a no-till system. So one thing that we tried loosely, but I would like to try again because we didn't really do it, I think, quite well enough, is to put like our no-till or our dry farm tomatoes into a no-till system, right? It seems like a crop that, again, developed in a no-till system, really aggressive plant that can deal with, you know, low water. Ideally, it should perform well in a no-till system. But where we tried it once, it didn't come off, but I think that would be an opportunity to do again. And that's a crop that, you know, we have seed that was originally saved. This is seed that Joe Shermer saved at Dirty Girl Farm. So he worked to dehybridize the Monsanto variety Early Girl. So he's been breeding that himself, and then we've saved our own seed on that for a number of years. So that's seed that's been bred in no farm conditions, saved in situ. And I think there's opportunities, again, I think for breeding on both sides, both the cash crop and the cover crop.
India had a couple of questions, and that was one of them. Another one, they are interested in seeing videos of the planter in action. Do you have those?
Email me. I do have some videos. Yeah.
And is there interest in strip till trials?
Yeah, I think strip till is interesting. I don't know, Tom, you might be able to speak better to this because
Most of our work with the tree farm of those 4 years was strip till.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to do completely. However, Phil actually has a pilot for right now in London.
Mhm.
The no-till is outperforming strip till, which is not performing too much lower than the full tillage.
Yeah.
All under plastic.
Yeah.
But, yeah, we, you know, go for as minimal strip till as we can, but pretty much for establishing, you know, either seed or transplants, it's often tough to get, you know, strip till, particularly in these heavy soil.
Yeah.
Most of our farms, all
Yeah.
of them.
So yeah, I mean, my sense from the folks that have been playing with this is that, yeah, strip till really, it provides a lot of opportunities for weed management around the crop that you can't do in the no-till system. There's still issues with cover crop termination and making sure it doesn't come back. But again, if you've kind of kept that away from the crop, you can do interesting other things. They've tried both like mini roller crimpers, right? That sit outside of the road to roll down stuff that bounces back. Like mini rotary mowers that mow outside of the crop. Again, these kind of like, and you should see, like, Jeff built a great one, right? I mean, it's like big to do this, like in between the row, inner row weeding. But it seems like it's been a little inconsistent in terms of the yields, because you're still not getting that full tillage in terms of, I think it's the nutrient mineralization is my guess. And then a little bit, probably some of that, the moisture issues. But I think there's also an interesting potential to think about, you know, I think at Full Belly, they did one trial where they overhead irrigated their crop the whole time. And if you've managed, again, I think if you have a system where you have the weeds right, like that creates a very different microclimate and kind of soil ecosystem that could support something like
You know, we
a
were
strip till.
talking about that. So we should have followed up on the overhead. If you have a crop that's adapted,
Yeah.
overhead irrigation all the way through, there's anecdotal evidence
Yeah.
that you can do okay.
Yeah.
In California, because you're kind of reproducing a Midwestern eastern climate in which no-till works a lot better.
Yeah.
But not all crops are adapted.
Yeah.
You need to pursue
Yeah.
that.
Could you define a strip till for people like me?
So a lot of the strip till tools, they'll till a width of anywhere from 4 to 6 inches, about like 2 to 4 inches deep. And so, you know, what is it? Actually, they're kind of these rolling baskets, right? There's basically a shank. Oftentimes there's a shank that will go through that will fracture the soil, rolling baskets to kind of work it a little bit, but they're fairly minimal in terms of their tillage. This isn't like a strip rototiller, right? That's really pulverizing the soil. These are ground driven implements that are working the soil up. So I think there's a lot of, potential for them, but they fall into that. I think they're more easily approachable, but they still haven't shown a lot of the success that we would hope they would, given their benefits.
Are there any plans here at the university to work on the hand scale version of no-till?
Yeah, so we're looking at that right now in both the garden sites. Again, Joji Muramoto is leading that research effort. Kind of comparing this surface compost addition with what we call our grower standard or gardener standard, which is some side forking or, not even double digging. And I think, something that we haven't really talked about, but I think is really important to highlight is that, this is something that Scott Park actually said to me early on when I was just looking into this work. And he said, what I want to know is what we're doing so bad, right? In terms of this organic tillage-based system, because a lot of these systems, especially folks like Scott and Full Belly and, stuff that like Leonard and Jim and Tom, like systems that you all have run, they produce incredible crops. They have increased soil organic matter and these really, what I call these organic plus systems. This isn't just the basics of organic. These are folks that are really stacking practices. You see these incredible benefits and, so much so that, right, studies out of, UC Davis have looked at, right, insect pressure on like Scott's field, right, and shown that his canning tomatoes versus canning tomatoes across the road, like he sees a lot less insect pressure because his soil is so much healthier. And they're now showing that these are things that we've said as organic growers for years, is like healthy soil grows a healthy plant, which can prevent disease, but they show the chemical indicators in those plants are higher in his crops because the soil is healthier. And this all gets back to the hand scale thing, because I think, we have gardens that have been managed with high compost additions, hand scale for decades. And I'm really curious if we're actually going to see market improvements when you go to a no-till compost addition system over those systems, because again, they really are functioning in kind of an ecological way at a very high level, right? Where we've really kind of changed soil properties in a way that, you know, even some of our faculty up on campus, when they look at some of the deep kind of carbon analysis of soil organic carbon at depth in the Chadwick Garden, right? Like Wei Jin is really surprised. He's like, there shouldn't be this much carbon this deep down. But because of how much double digging and compost additions have happened in that garden over years, I'm curious to see what type of improvement there is. So yeah, that's the long answer to the hand scale question.
Great segue to the last question we have
Okay.
so far, and that is, are low-till or even high-till systems in your study still able to sequester carbon from the atmosphere? So,
Yeah. So yeah, and I don't know why I didn't have those slides on here. We showed no significant difference in terms of, we looked at both the kind of the I'm blanking on my words here right now, but both kind of carbon stocks, as well as some of the POX-C carbon, the really kind of fast turnover carbon. And we didn't see any differences across our treatments in that. So that's somewhat expected, because across 3 years, we wouldn't expect to see much difference. Oftentimes those changes take a little bit more time. So yeah, I think, but that's really still the goal. The important question is, against what baseline would be the question, especially in organic, when I think about organic tillage-based systems. And I think when you look at kind of meta-analyses of organic systems, you see variation. You see the potential to have more soil organic matter and soil organic carbon, but you also see some instances where you don't. But I would be really interested to compare like baseline organic systems with, again, some of these organic plus systems, because what we know is that when you stack these organic practices, you will see increases in soil organic matter relative to, again, a conventional production system, right? And a perfect example of that is like our soil up here, you know, the kind of potentially the baseline, and Jim, you can correct me if I'm wrong on some of this, but I think it hovers around like 3 to maybe 3.6% soil organic matter, and kind of like in the, not even native grassland, but in the grassland that we had before we started tilling it. We can maintain levels in our tillage-based system on that sandy loam soil of between 2.5 to maybe 2.9%. Sometimes we can push up past 3%, but mostly it stays in that high 2s. As soon as you go into the gardens, which is on the same soil with lighter kind of tillage, they can push that 3.5 to 4%. Soil organic matter. So again, I think just to speak to like the potential of organic tillage-based systems to hold certain levels of soil organic matter, absolutely. I think with the practices of compost, cover crop, and responsible tillage. So I still think that, and this gets back to maybe a pet peeve of mine, or something you'll hear me talk about in the future, which is like, the organic movement really needs to do a better job of framing even organic tillage as a regenerative practice, because of what it does do for soil health and for the potential for carbon sequestration relative to conventional systems. And I think right now, a lot of the language on regenerative ag is really focused on these no-till systems and what they can do in the Midwest. And a lot of the backing behind that is because it's a way for, I think, larger growers to support a more ecological process that isn't as hard as having to take, again, the pesticides and herbicides out of their system. So that's why I think we see a lot of the push for regenerative right now coming from folks like General Mills and these large, why it has so much traction. But I think the organic folks really need to push how successful they've been without pesticides as well, and specifically on specialty crops. Yeah, come more in the room. Yeah, Jane. Yeah, the question is about labor needs for organic specialty crops, how it might change compared to a tillage-based system. I think ideally it wouldn't again, you have to kind of compare apples to apples. So I think about, right, a really high functioning organic system that probably has the right tools for weed management. And I think that we might not see a lot of labor saving because again, in those systems, ideally, again, thinking about like the California context of larger organic farms, right? If you have a system where the weeding is mostly mechanized, that should essentially be the same for the no-till system. I think you might reduce your number of passes where you wouldn't have to do a number of weeding passes. But I think ideally in an organic system, you're not having to do a lot of hand weeding anyway. I know that's not the reality for many organic farms, but I think that's more, to me, there's an issue of like, we have organic systems that have basically all mechanical weed management. And there's an issue about access to that technical equipment and capital. That's an issue to get some of those existing farms up to that scale, up to that kind of efficiency. And then beyond that, I think you'd maybe see a little bit, but not a marked difference with that. Yeah. Yeah, so question was about insect prevalence in no-till and whether that actually harbored more insects. We didn't see that in our system in lettuce and broccoli. I think Phil has expressed maybe some potential for corn ear. You had mentioned something recently about corn earworm potentially. Yeah. But I hadn't seen it. I think it's in the research that I've done, I didn't pay as close attention to that, but again, the results are really variable. And I think it's really crop by crop and then how those crops intersect with insect pressures in particular microclimates. So that's why it's really hard to kind of pull out takeaways. Because again, some cucurbits might see it a lot more in certain areas, but others might not. So the data was a little bit inconclusive, but again, there's such little out there and it's so inconsistent, but I could imagine for some crops that could be a really serious issue. I didn't see it in our system. Jim. Yeah, question was about symphyllans. We didn't see any pressure in our system, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah. Snails and slugs was another comment. Again, we didn't see that in our across the lettuce and broccoli, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a lot more of it. So, and I know that, yeah, there is some research out there, but yeah, I'm probably not, I don't have it in the front of my head right now. Yeah.
I like that just like questions. I do spend time scouting at hills.
Oh, nice.
And so I'm like, I gotta know like the questions in no-till versus the shallow versus the full till. I mean, the open country, that's a great question because yes, corn melon has been an issue, but it was not just. It was just easier for you.
Yeah.
But decomposers, we talked about like microbial decomposers, which are super important, of course, and they're going to be there. But what about our like, our bigger, like earwigs and stuff like that? Did you guys see her friends or what would you tell me about your?
Yeah. So the question is like with deep need, like tell me about pest pressures and differences in the no-till versus shallow till and full till. And again, we didn't really collect data on that. So we had to limit what we could do.
I will take it.
Yeah. I mean, even anecdotally, I didn't see really any issues across with those pressures outside of like gophers. Right. Yeah. And that was serious for us, but I mean, I know I saw a lot more earthworms. That was really clear. But no, there wasn't, and again, our system was a little different in that it was like a no mulch or low residue system. So we didn't really create that thatch that was going to create that harboring space. Yeah. But I think that, again, where I'm leaning now is like, that's not a viable system. You need that mulch to really support all of those processes together. So I'd be really, again, what I would like to do in the plot, and we may propose this for future years, is just to say, look, we're going to take that plot. We're actually going to just split it into 2 simple treatments of a tillage and a no-till, take the shallow till out for ease of management, and just start putting cover crops and a lot of compost down, till one side, don't till the other side, and just kind of see what happens. And we could do some of these things like look at weed shifts. We could do some of these things like look at insect and pest abundance, right? These are things that we can do with our students that are really easy to monitor. But that's the type of thing where, to get to some of those questions, I think we need to run a system that's easy to manage, where we're not trying to grow a cash crop, because, like, to be frank, like, we just don't know how to do it yet. And we struggle so much to get these crops going. After we do that for 2 or 3 years, like, maybe I'd put a single line of broccoli in and see how it performs. Or
and trying to solve like the brand. We're trying to immediately go from full till to no till and grow the same crop with the same yields, and it's like, we got a lot of steps to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like we were saying before, about like the plastic culture has the promise, and how beautiful that, like, we're a moist area and we that's what the environment is happening, and all of like beautiful insects as well. So
Yeah. Well, let me riff off that for a second, because because I think because I think, this question, I think it's really important, this transition period, because when you look at the no-till transition for conventional, again, that graph that I showed in terms of accumulated like profits, they look at that return over time at like 11 years, right? And some of the soil properties you see start to kick in at like 7 to 10 years. But you also have to remember that in those systems, they're able to supplement nutrients with ammonia, this really easily accessible nitrogen that I think gets them through that transition period. And we just can't do that. So unless we, and this would, in terms of like what we use, I mean, some of the, like the soy protein hydrolase or whatever it's called, like that might be something, but it's like, that's not economically viable at all for how expensive it is. But I think that we might need to prime our systems in a different way. And that's where, again, putting on 150 tons of compost per acre for 3 years with 2 rounds of cover cropping, right? Like maybe after that point, you have a system that has enough kind of nutrient cycling happening within that top like 0 to 8 inches that you could actually get a crop off of it, but it might take that. And I think it's unrealistic to ask somebody like Phil to do that setup. And that's where I think, again, when I think about like what a research station like us should be doing, it's like, that's what we need to be looking at over time. Yeah.
Get through that period, but that period is, I think, the important thing. That's an important enough to get at, because we all want to get there, but how?
Yeah.
And how long is it going to take? Can I ask you some you have to
Yeah. Are we slated to go till? Yeah. Are we slated to go till 7 though? 6:30. I'm here. Thank you for protecting my time, Louise. This is, to be honest, like this is what I was hoping would happen for this presentation. Cause like I could give the academic one, but like we have folks, I think in the room, and especially if there's folks online that want to chime in too, that have been working in this for some time. So, this is where I think it gets rich and we start to build a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not trying to have context right at that question, but what's
the background of, so the question was about the context for increased profit over 10 years. And that's these really kind of formal economic analyses of like no-till corn, where they're really looking at like, if you decrease your tractor passes you'll see decreased yields early. And again, in a lot of no-till systems, you see continued like decreased yield over conventional tillage, but because you've decreased your expenses as well, you can have a higher profit. And so the idea is that over time, as the system performs better and better, you'll see a net increase in your profit, even if your overall yield is a little bit lower. But that's where a lot of no-till conventional growers see their benefit, is because they have less fertilizer costs, they might have less spraying costs, they have less tractor passes, and on a per acre basis, that's where you see it accumulate over time. So yeah, but it's not particularly applicable, again, to like these specialty crop systems, which are, you know, and one thing we haven't even touched on that is really important is like the tools that we have as organic growers are so much more limited than the conventional ones. So when we have these climate fluctuations, like if you're relying on biomass for weed management and you have a drought year where we only have 6 to 12 inches of rain up here, like our biomass is going to be so much smaller than it would be. And so what do you do in a year like that? And so I think a little bit, some of the dogma around strictly no-till versus tillage, we may have to get past that as well and think about what are the lessons that we can learn from no-till, but we can incorporate into a more rotational system and not feel like we're, again, destroying our soil by, although like the research shows that like we do, when you look at some of the macro pores and soil structure and aggregation, right? Like you can destroy what you've built over 10 years in a single pass, right? Like that is true. And it may have to be a practical, right, trade-off in terms of how we apply these systems in this, like in this space. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, yeah. Wait. Okay. Tom, did you have something or?
Well, there's just all kinds of things, of course. But you were talking about insects. When you leave high biomass on the surface, you're creating a very different environment that is more hospitable to certain kinds of insects. And so in one of our really important trials that we did at Phil Foster's, the total no-till under plastic, we got hammered with erosion. They basically took out all the transplant.
What crop?
Before we knew what was going on, watermelon.
Watermelon.
In the strip till, also significant, but way less.
Yeah.
And the full till, nada. We had everything. So we really confounded that whole trial.
Yep.
Because, you know, we had to replant and all that sort of thing. However, we had, you know, Bill has access to spinosad, which is an organic control method. Once we knew that we were going to have this kind of exposure, the next year, you know, treated it again. But you're creating a very different environment. So you got to be aware of that.
Yeah.
That was like one of the steps that we learned when we're trying to no-till, was like, okay, well, so we need to put down the bait when as we put the plants in the ground so that we continue that crop.
Yeah.
And that has helped significantly in the last 3 years.
Yeah. So just for the folks online, I'll say it again. Tom was referencing trials at Phil's, where in the no-till for watermelon, the earwig pressure was so intense that it just took out the crop. It was a little less in the strip till and totally non-existent in the full till. And then in the next season, applying spinosad at planting was a way to really control that. But these are things, we need to learn. And I think this is another, again, the kind of plasticulture and some of the occultation work, I think, is a potential thing to learn from the hand scale folks that have really been using this for cover crop breakdown and bed prep. And I think that is a potential tool. Again, it's hard to imagine how you would spread it across acres. But knowing that people do remay across acres, like somebody can come up with this. Well, Phil, tried it at Phil's a little bit, but I think in terms of like, what I think about is our system, right? I think it got a little bit out of control. We built up a lot of weeds. And I think what we'll need to do is use a technique like that to refresh it the same way you would use tillage, to really try to control, I think, weed pressure that's out there. I don't know how it will deal with the grasses, but if we leave it tarped for enough time, that might be something that we can play with in these systems as an additional tool that I think is worth kind of learning from, even if it's not specifically plasticulture while you have the crop, but more in between times. But that also requires you taking that land out of production, right, in coastal areas to get the breakdown that you need. This isn't like 3 weeks like you get in the Midwest where you have high temperatures, like you probably need 6 to 8 weeks to have anything that's meaningful. And that, right, Tom's rubbing his fingers together, like that's money, right? So again, this is where, yeah, I think understanding the potential of some of these, interesting.
Talk a lot about putting compost in the surface. Isn't one of the big points of this to grow that biomass in form of roots on the surface?
Yeah, so the question is about putting compost on the surface, and isn't the purpose to grow biomass underground? So yeah, absolutely. And I think the hope is that compost applied at the surface would support some leaching of nutrients and other, just support kind of the mulching effect that would support soil development, that would support some of that root activity. But that's something we'd really need to look at, right? And something that I think would be really interesting to see if we get, like we would learn a lot from how cover crops would perform in a no-till compost, like surface compost addition versus put the same amount of compost in a tillage-based system and see how those two crops perform. Like that, we would learn a lot from what that would look like. So yeah, I don't have an answer, but I think I'd be interested to look at it.
You're mentioning research opportunities figuring out like no-till spread, like cover crops, right? Like complement whatever cat crops. And then you said like at first year that you don't get a lot of biomass and stuff like that. So it's like the other that's common sense. But finding the rise, it's a biomass in your tank that's like a bad religion. That's sort of like definitely going for it.
Yeah, and I think we need to think about what are yeah, it would be about like how long these crops take to mature, what their biomass is. You look at something like barley that could mature a lot earlier, but probably has, I don't know, is it like 20% of the biomass of like a rye of Merced rye? I mean, the barley's like that and the rye's like that. So, crossing those things, I think different strains of vetch, vetch is a really promising one because it is so high in nitrogen and does, I think, so much fixing underground. But right now, a lot of those mature way too late. And so we may have to pair some of this again with climate change. I think there's a really interesting question about looking at cover crop establishment. Like when I was here 20 years ago as an apprentice, right, we used to say October 15th was cover crop planting date. And for like, aside from last year, which was crazy, and the year before that, we got one rain event, but like the 8 years previous, like cover crop planting date was November 15th every single year, right? Because it had gotten pushed back that much further. What that does in terms of that 1 month of growing for cover crops at that nice time of year is crazy for your biomass production, depending on what happens with late spring rains. But I think there's an option to think about, what does it look like actually to irrigate up some cover crops using that water early? Do we get benefits in terms of, again, nitrogen scavenging and protection from those early rains, but also biomass production? So again, there could be an opportunity to use like no-till, or even, I mean, Jim, you played around a lot with basically undercutting a crop and then not tilling and just drilling that cover crop right into it. That's a practice that we could use to prevent a lot of that nitrogen leaching. If we pair that with irrigation in October now, like what could that lead to for no-till crops? So anyway, it's a long way of saying like, there's lots of things we could look at. And you think about like the immense resources that are developed towards varietal breeding and selection in conventional systems. If we just had, I mean, and this is what OFRF is working on, right? In terms of a high policy levels, like organic research funding is at such a small percent relative to its market impact right now. And like, if we had just some of those dollars to support some of this research, I think it could go a long way. So Organic Farming Research Foundation. Yeah. So they operate they're doing a lot of work on the national policy level right now to support organic research funding.
Feeling on that point, down in front
Mhm. Yeah, comment about transition. Leonard, hey.
some of the things you said earlier about rotation resonate with me. And I think finding a less purist system that you were referring to resonates with me. So that if there were no-till systems that were 3 years rotating to a more traditional organic system, then rotating to something else. The issue seems to be how much you make on those rotational systems. And the comment was made about putting compost on top of the ground. Well, right now, putting compost on top of the ground might potentially pay the grower if they're putting compost on for these municipalities that are needing to have compost spread. And so we use the term ecosystem services occasionally. If you could get paid for that service in those off seasons as opposed for the crop.
Yep.
So that your business model shifted, and in those rotational seasons, the revenue would come from a different place rather than the crop. And I think that's the matchup that's got to be made too. It's not just with the crops and the cover crops, it's with how you get paid during those off seasons.
Yeah. So again, just for folks online, Leonard was saying what resonated with him was maybe the not purist system, the potential for rotations. And then this idea of compost applications being an ecosystem service and actually getting paid for that from municipalities that need to move this compost. And having that be a different revenue stream for growers. And I think that gets to some of this, again, this outside of the box thinking, where thinking about our working agricultural lands as important for nutrient dense food production, but also as a place to put some of this carbon and hope that it stays in the ground. So I think that's, I think really, a good point in terms of thinking about how do we make this whole system work outside of just that kind of economic yield-based metrics.
Was the takeaway that organic tillage is basically like neutral, like it kind of goes up and comes down?
Yeah, the question was about in carbon sequestration, is organic tillage kind of neutral and goes up and goes down? I don't think there's been good enough studies that look at what I would call organic plus systems and the idea of stacked organic practices. And that's where I would love to really look at that in a more robust sense to understand, like, if a system is actually doing cover cropping, compost, and crop rotations, how does that perform relative? Because some of these organic systems and studies are really very basic, like certified organic systems that maybe aren't applying a certain level of compost and aren't cover cropping as much as they could. So I think, there's a question there. One thing I meant to comment on your comment, Leonard, is that, and I don't know enough about this body of research, but there's a lot of work being done in range systems with compost applications. So these are no-till systems where they're grazing cattle and they're applying compost and they're seeing carbon sequestration and better grass production in those systems. And I think it's exactly the same for the veggie system. So, I think there's some, potential overlap in terms of understanding what those folks are doing. But they've seen a lot of really good benefits, and the folks up in Marin in particular are doing really good work on this. So I think, it'd be interesting to see how that impacts, again, vegetable production systems, even in a rotational sense, right? Where it's like, maybe you don't till for 2 years and then you till for the next 3, but that has the potential, I think, to have some long-term benefits.
Some of the SIG reporting at EcoFarm last year, Full Belly had mentioned that some of their best cropping was following the no-till, and it makes so much sense, right? You do your no-till and you don't get a yield that year, but you do get a yield the next year. And you have better till and you have better infiltration.
So Jim was reflecting on the folks at Full Belly said some of their best production years in the tillage-based system were after they had some of their trial plots in no-till. And I mean, it mirrors the kind of fallow system, right? Where you fallow a field for a number of years, or the lay system where you're growing grass or hay on it. When we used to have integrated animal vegetable cropping systems, and then you turn it in, right? And this is we're kind of like coming back to that. So, Elise? Tom, is your research available? This is Tom Willie, the T&D Willie Farms.
That Jeff Mitchell actually wrote a very large report, and basically in our.
NRCS.
NRCS.
Yeah.
From where we derive our funding from. Can certainly make that available if people want. They can contact Jeff Mitchell and myself.
Yeah.
Uh,
So,
But a lot of it's in people's.
yeah.
Yeah, we were not writing a PhD.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
documentation
Yeah.
is not, stellar.
So yeah, question was, is some of the research that Tom was referring to, it hasn't been published. The response was Jeff Mitchell at UC Davis was in charge of that grant for the NRCS and submitted a big report. So contact me or Jeff if you want access to that. I don't think it's been published in academic journals yet.
No,
He-
there's no intention.
Yeah.
other than that.
Yeah. Yeah, and no intention to publish, and we have to mention Jeff, because Jeff has been doing work on no-till. I mean, I think he did a trial up here with Jim in the mid-90s. Yeah, I mean, he's been pushing on this across conventional and organic, and yeah, he needs to come and really do a download of all of his ideas, but
If somebody contacts us, we'll do as much as we can.
yeah.
Like the first trial we did was with pumpkins, we got a yield reduction was so huge that Jeff said.
Yeah. So Jim was saying the yield reduction was so huge in the trial he did with Jeff that they decided not to publish it.
How long to show that it's still.
Yep.
Same.
Yeah. So I like to be the scapegoat and say like, yeah, this great trial system that we developed totally failed, and that's contributing to the scientific knowledge and movement forward. So yeah, I'm happy to fall on that.
Daryl?
Yeah.
When you live in the Silicon Valley and you start asking people about regenerative ag, seems like the thing that comes right to the surface real fast is, well, we're, the Veda reverse time tiller, because it saves so many tractor passes, so it's a fuel reduction, so it's a carbon.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's a carbon savings, but do you have any thoughts on that, or have you?
So the question is about large scale Salinas Valley growers, how they respond to questions about regenerative, a lot of reliance on the Veda reverse tilling system that is basically single pass for bed turnover and shaping. A lot of folks are using that in salad mix production or in head lettuce production. And that they would have a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions because they're reducing passes. Sometimes those are paired with deep ripping shanks too, right? They'll do like a pass with deep ripping shanks and then pull that through for like 2 passes. I think I've seen that as well. So, I mean, that's an improvement, right? It's a step in the right direction, right? It may not be what I think some folks are thinking about in regenerative. I will say, and I'm gonna blank on the name, but some of the large farms, Taylor Farms, and some of the other, I'm really kicking myself for blanking on this right now. Braga. So Braga in particular, they're doing some really incredible work around no-till and reduced till systems. And I need to get down there and check those folks out because they're really dedicating some significant resources towards it. And really interesting, like row cropping of rye and then moving their crops over. I mean, really stuff that we would never think about as possible. So I think there's maybe more innovation down there than we know about. And tying into some of those folks would be really interesting. And I know they're really keen on it. Yeah. Yeah. Was this at the field day? Kapolei field day? Yeah. Yeah. So a lot to learn from those folks. Yeah. And I'm not up on it enough to know exactly what that looks like. Yeah. Well, we'll connect. So the comment was Braga Fresh. They're a Braga. Yeah. And they do a lot of salad mix in our region. They're like one of the smaller big growers. So just like a couple thousand acres, not like tens of thousands, I think. They're okay. Yeah. So they're but I guess the comment at the Cal Poly field day was like 2 inches of tillage is what you need. That was a takeaway. Yeah. I'm gonna believe it. All right, we'll do last question because we're getting up on 7.
kind of related to past, but what about like passive costing fuel? What about tractors that don't use fuel, like contractors?
Yeah. So there's a question about electronic tractors in terms of reducing emissions. And yeah, I think that's an easier way to go, honestly. I think we're trying to, in terms of decreasing those emissions. I know there's a lot of companies that are working on this, and yeah, I don't know. I'm not as up on some of the larger tractors that could replace our current diesel tractors in terms of how long they can operate for, how you swap batteries and questions like that. Those are some of the major issues folks are trying to figure out right now. But, you know, electric motors are a lot better suited to agriculture because they have higher torque. So they actually operate a lot better and more efficiently. So I think there's a lot of promise once we figure out some of those charging issues. I will say that we're working with a local company in Watsonville called Farm NG that's working on a small, basically to replace like a cultivating tractor. So replace something that's in the 20 to 30 horsepower for a couple beds to do your weeding. And that's some exciting other research that we can, talk about. But yeah, but they're doing great work. But I think we're still, I don't know enough about like Monarch and Solitech and the other companies that are doing large electric tractors.
Intersecting different ways of studying and creating
Yeah.
by creating things like newer technologies, and not only just focusing on compost, but focusing on partnering with other, like, you know, innovative companies that want to actually find a way to also benefit through that kind of participation.
Yeah, the comment was about, interesting intersections to partner with companies that are trying to develop this as more other revenue generation. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing we've been approached by there's, you know, the whole agrivoltaics thing is an idea that's out there, and the systems that they're trying to develop now, a lot of them have been adapted in like livestock settings, but some of these systems are developing are very similar to what we would consider hoop house production, right? Where they actually have their foundations on like 20-foot centers. And so you can still get electricity generation on the farm and the potential to tie that in. So there's, without taking out too much land out of production, because you really can't produce underneath those panels. But I think that's a great comment. So, okay, well, maybe we'll wrap it up there. Thanks to everybody here. Thanks to everybody online. Really appreciate you coming out and having this conversation.
Thank all of you for coming and asking some questions. Hopefully this discussion will continue on.
Thanks, Jonna.